What I'm about to say is not coming from trend culture, drug culture, or recycled spiritual language. It is coming from what I have been shown very clearly about this space and what is actually happening when people try to enter it by force. DMT has been coming up around me again, and I looked into it because I wanted to know what it actually is, not what people say it is. And what I see very clearly is that this is not a clean spiritual path. It is not a pure source-led opening. It is a forced access point. People justify it by saying it is natural because it comes from nature, but that logic does not hold. Plenty of things come from nature. That does not mean you are meant to force them into your body in order to break into a state of consciousness that was never open to you in a natural way. Just because something grows out of the ground does not mean it is the correct doorway. That is the first distortion around DMT. People treat natural origin as if it proves spiritual legitimacy. It does not. A thing can be naturally occurring and still be used in a way that violates right order. And that is what this looks like to me. It looks like people are forcing entry into a space they were never meant to access that way. They are not arriving there through rightful inner development, clear discernment, or true spiritual maturity. They are chemically breaching a threshold. That matters. Because once you understand it as a breach, instead of a blessing, the whole conversation changes. Now it is no longer about expanding consciousness. It becomes a question of whether someone is pushing themselves through a wall that was never meant to be pushed through in the first place. And that is exactly what it looks like is happening. There is a real mechanism around this. There is a reason so many people come back from those experiences talking in fragments, symbols, feelings, and giant cosmic claims, but almost never with clean, coherent, usable truth. They come back with intensity. They come back with imagery. They come back with emotional certainty, but they really come back with something clear enough to actually hold up in real life without distortion all over it. That is not a small detail. That is one of the biggest clues. If this were a clean source access point, truth would come back clean. It would not come back scrambled, over-symbolized, distorted, and impossible to ground. Truth does not need that much static around it. So, what is actually happening? What I see is that there is a real threshold there, but it is being entered wrongly. There is some truth in that space, but the people using DMT are not bringing that truth back cleanly because they are bypassing rightful access. They are forcing themselves into a mixed space and then trying to interpret what they saw after the fact. And because the entry itself is wrong, the information comes back wrong too. That is why so many people build whole spiritual identities around these experiences without actually becoming clearer. They become more attached to the experience, more attached to the imagery, more attached to the feeling of having touched something beyond themselves. But they do not actually become more aligned, more grounded, or more able to carry truth cleanly. That should tell you everything. And the other thing that has become very obvious is that it's not just an isolated drug issue. It is part of a larger false spiritual mechanism. It trains people to believe that forced access is the same as spiritual authority. It trains them to think that intensity is the same as truth. It trains them to trust altered states over clean discernment. That is a huge problem, because once someone starts believing that the strongest feeling is the highest truth, they become easy to manipulate. They stop checking what is real. They stop checking whether what they are receiving is clean. They stop asking whether they had any right to be in that space at all. They just become devoted to the experience. And devotion to an experience is not the same thing as alignment and truth. That is another reason this matters. People do not just use DMT once and move on. Many of them become attached to the access point itself. They want to go back. They want to repeat it. They want to get more. And that is where it starts looking less like revelation and more like dependence. If a space keeps pulling you back, but does not give you clean truth, then you need to ask what exactly you are in a relationship with. Because True Source does not need to hook you like that. True Source does not need to bait you with impossible beauty, mechanical entities, cosmic architecture, elf-like beings, or overwhelming sensory spectacle in order to keep your attention. That kind of thing may be real within that space, but that does not mean it is rightful. and it definitely does not mean it is clean. People are also starting to talk more openly now about being blocked from that space. That matters too. There are people saying that access no longer works the same way. People saying they are being shut out. People saying something has changed. People saying they cannot get back to where they once went. That fits. Because if this has been a stolen access route, then of course there would come a point where that route stops holding the same way. Of course there would be restriction. Of course there would be a conflict around it. Of course, the people who built identities around forced access would start noticing that something is wrong. And if that is happening, then what people are calling a bad trip or a block trip may actually be something much bigger than that. It may be the closure of a route that was never rightful to begin with. That would explain a lot. It would explain why the spiritual community built around these substances feels so hollow now. It would explain why so much of the so-called insight just loops back into love and light language, spiritual performance, or symbolic noise. It would explain why the same people who claim to have seen beyond the veil still cannot bring back anything that truly corrects the world around them, because they are not actually bringing back source truth cleanly. They are bringing back fragments filtered through forced access and distorted interpretation. And that is why I don't see this as a path that I need. Years ago, I looked at it. Years ago, I considered it. But something in me knew it was wrong. Not wrong because it was scary. Wrong because it felt like a violation. Wrong because it felt like forcing my way somewhere I was not meant to go by that method. And if something is true, I should not have to violate myself to reach it. That is where I stand now. A real spiritual path does not need chemical breach points. A real source-led path does not need me to override my own vessel just to access truth. If truth is real, then it can be reached in right order. If a space can only be entered by force, then that tells me something is off before I even begin. And that is the part people do not want to hear, because a lot of people have built their whole sense of spiritual meaning on these experiences. A lot of people do not want to admit that the thing they trusted may have been mixed from the beginning. A lot of people would rather defend the doorway than question whether they were ever meant to use it. But I think that question matters more than ever now. Not everything that gives access gives rightful access. Not everything that feels expanded is truth. Not everything that appears mystical is clean. And not every open door was meant to be entered. So no, I do not believe DMT is a clean, true source path. I believe it is a forced threshold. I believe there is some truth around that space, but I do not believe the people using it are accessing that truth rightfully. I believe the information comes back distorted because the entry point itself is distorted. And I believe that what many people call a spiritual journey is actually a bypass around rightful access. That is why I have no interest in it whatsoever. And that is also why I think more people need to stop romanticizing breach as enlightenment. Because if a person has to force themselves into a space to get answers, then maybe the real problem is not that they have not found the truth. Maybe the problem is that they are looking for truth in a place that was never meant to be entered that way. That is the real message.